as they occurred to me, and I took some notes. Okay, so on Kelsang Rapten, he regards the idea that the worship of Dorje Shugden is harmful to the Dalai Lama's life as implausible. And I think it's just important to note that in a traditional Tibetan Buddhist context, there's nothing implausible about that. You know, the fifth Dalai Lama would use tantric rituals as a military, technique against his enemies. In addition to things like armies and the traditional, military technologies, he also used tantric rituals. So, if a tantric ritual is capable of killing Mongols, it's probably also capable of harming the life of the Dalai Lama. So I find nothing, I may find something implausible about that, but if I do it as a kind of Western empirical viewpoint, but from a traditional viewpoint, there's nothing implausible about that. Yeah, and then I think that although the Dalai Lama may have said that the propitiation of Dorje Shugden is sort of bad for the cause, I sometimes felt like he was characterizing that position as it's Dorje Shugden's fault that China annexed Tibet. And I think that that's a bit a bit of overplaying. Certainly, the Dalai Lama must think that there was something to do with the People's Liberation Army and Mao Zedong, and these may have also factored into the annexation of Tibet by China. So, turning to Geshe Tashi Tsering's talk, the point that in the writings of Tsongkhapa and Khedruk Je and so on, Dorje Shugden is not mentioned is, of course, the case because Dorje Shugden sort of hadn't been invented yet. Yeah, I mean, some people may take issue with this term, invented, but in any case, the propitiation of Dorje Shugden hadn't been introduced into the kind of ritual repertoire of the Gaylord School. That doesn't necessarily have any bearing on the orthodoxy or status of the practice in later times. And by way of analogy, I would say if you look at the writings of Thomas Aquinas. If you look at the writings of Thomas Aquinas, there'll be no mention of Our Lady of Fatima. Well, that doesn't mean that Our Lady of Fatima is some kind of worldly spirit who's doing evil. It just means that history moves forward. Yeah. I thought it was very interesting to hear this list of people in the past who had thought the propitiation of Dorje Shugden was problematic. But I think also that can be overemphasized. We saw from Martin's presentation, and then also in Thierry's that, let's say before the 1970s within the Gaylord School, it's certainly the case that the practice of Dorje Shugden was seen as far less problematic than it is now seen. Yeah. So I think that's something to keep in mind. And then I also wanted to mention that several of the presentations hit or touched upon the origin of the figure of Dorje Shugden and the death of Parpa Gyaltsen. I just want to point out that in terms of Tibetan studies, that story is seen as somewhat, let's say, maybe not. It may be that that's a story that only we can only have evidence of long after the events that are being described, and there are other explanations for how the propitiation of Dorje Shugden was introduced into the Gaylord School. So turning to Carol's talk, to the extent that Carol's talk was about our personal experience, there's far less to say about it. I found sort of one theme interesting with sort of 2 points, which is the question of kind of continuity versus change. So on the one hand, it sounds like the kind of ritual program within an NKT center is actually quite different from let's say, a traditional Geluk ritual program as it might have been seen, let's say, in Lhasa in the 1940s. So that doesn't necessarily mean anything. As I said, things change. But it seems a bit to contrast with this sort of kind of claim to orthodoxy, and just the name Nukadampa is definitely sort of playing towards orthodoxy, and yet in certain ways Geshe Kelsang Gyatso, is willing to innovate in terms of the ritual program. So that's interesting. And then, but the other thing I noticed is some of the things she picked up as problematic, like sort of putting your teacher in your heart, the vow of Samaya, where you see your teacher is doing no wrong, the question of accumulation of merit and teaching in particular accumulating merit. These are all completely standard things in Tibetan Buddhism, which is not to say that they may not have been misused. Of course, tantric practice is seen as very powerful for leading to enlightenment, but of course also traditional teachers will tell you it's very dangerous. But I just wanted to emphasize to people who may not have context that many of these things she was mentioning are quite common, including something like the fear of hell, and then also sexual misconduct or sexual harassment is very well known in other Tibetan Buddhist schools. So it's important maybe just not to overstate how unique that situation might be. Turning to Martin's presentation, I hope we'll get to see the end of it in his 5 minutes. I found it maybe the most informative in a sense in terms of showing us what was the propitiation of Dorje Shugden like sort of before the flaring up of this controversy in a traditional setting. And it is clear that, let's say, for at least in that monastery in Ladakh, in the early 1990s, this was just a normal part of the ritual program and was unproblematic. So then on Thierry's talk, I thought it was important, he emphasized the fifth Dalai Lama and the fifth Dalai Lama's use of Nyingma ritual practices, and I was trying to keep my comments at the beginning short. I do think this is an important observation, and that the 14th Dalai Lama is quite interested in kind of recalling the memory of the fifth and the sort of ritual decisions of the fifth, and if you like, the ecumenicism of the fifth. The fifth is a very famous, very powerful guy, so if you kind of act like the fifth, that's going to give you a certain amount of credentials. And to some extent, what's interesting to me is that although the institution of the Dalai Lama and the hierarchy of the Gaylord Church are extremely intertwined and have been for a long time, to some extent one can recognize the Dalai Lama as an independent institution and has its own kind of ritual interests and legitimacy interests that to some extent can be isolated from those of the Gaylord hierarchy. And I agree with him certainly by saying that no controversy is black and white. Turning to the last presentation, the question of whether Dorje Shugden is a spirit or an enlightened being gets a lot of air. I think it's important to use the Tibetan terms in these contexts because using English can exaggerate the seeming differences. And I think that Martin's talk pointed to this. And then I also think it's important to recognize that whether a particular entity is a worldly spirit or a fully enlightened Buddha is not a question that is amenable to empirical verification. I also thought that certain statements he made were a bit exaggerated, such as Buddhism, the Buddhist world is divided. Certainly in Thailand and Sri Lanka, and no one cares about it. And in fact, also the kind of innovativeness of this schism. There's a schism in the Karmakagyu sect as well. There was a civil war between the Prince of Tsang and the fifth Dalai Lama. Violence and schism and divisiveness is a hoary tradition in Tibetan Buddhism, and that should be also kept in mind. And I think to some extent both sides of this debate kind of overplay its significance because they're coming at the world from a Gaelic perspective, and as a non-Gaelic, I want to make that point. Nonetheless,